Every literary genre has its celebrated pantheon, authors and works which come to define those following in their footsteps for decades. And in the world of naturalist animal xenofiction, few writers have cast a longer shadow than Richard Adams. With an effect on the genre comparable to that which Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings had on modern fantasy, Adams' magnificent debut, Watership Down, blended naturalism with mythic cultural anthropomorphizing, and thereby established a new subgenre of xenofiction against which all of his successors have inevitably been measured. In the decades since his Lapine epic's publication in 1972, numerous authors have followed suit with other species, the most prominent among them being Adams' fellow Englishmen William Horwood, Gary Kilworth, and David Clement Davies. But while some of these stories follow the beats of their predecessor more closely than others, none have truly managed to establish themselves beyond the narrative and thematic shadow cast by Adams' debut. It is here that we come to the subject of this video, one of the earliest authors to take inspiration from Watership Down, and simultaneously the most radically inventive of Adams' successors. Another Englishman, one whose work's time has largely, and unfairly, forgotten, Brian Carter. Born in England in 1937, as a child, Carter suffered through the indiscriminate German bombing campaign of the opening stages of the Second World War, leaving him burdened with what we today would recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder. Throughout the remainder of his childhood, he would suffer from recurring night terrors and health problems, and, at the advice of a physician, was encouraged to spend as much time as possible roaming the wilds of Dartmoor in southern England. It was there, among the tangled greenery and pristine air of a wilderness rapidly vanishing from much of the modern Western world, given further life by vivid tales of Welsh mythology passed down from his mother, that he would develop a fascination with nature and all its inhabitants, deriving the inspiration for not only a regular column in his local paper, but a series of xenofiction novels published throughout the 1980s, comprising some of the strongest works in the genre. The first of these, and the primary focus of this video, his 1981 xenofiction debut, A Black Fox Running, easily ranks among the greatest novels I have ever read, and it is with this that we shall begin. Any avid reader of animal xenofiction, especially of the mythic variety, will be familiar with the refrain, "This novel is just Watership Down with X species." And while this comparison is fairer in some instances than others, Firebringer follows the beats of Adams' novel far closer than Hunter's Moon or Callanish, for example, Carter's nearly forgotten masterpiece may very well be the only work of mythic xenofiction to truly venture beyond the creative territory demarcated by Watership Down. Blending the radically inventive societal world-building of its predecessor with the brutal, unflinching realism of Daniel Mannix's The Fox and the Hound, and the mystically infused existentialism of Olaf Stapledon's Sirius, Carter transcribes every line of his vulpine tale of adventure and survival in prose as magnificent and lyrical as that of J.A. Baker's The Peregrine. Vega twinkled in the tawny owl's eyes, and minute noises scratched the darkness. Insects ticked against leaves and stems. Earthworms came slowly out of their burrows with a whisper of tiny bristles. Little escaped the ears of Wulfgar and Stargrief. They dug out a nest of young rabbits and ate their fill. River song crept up through the trees, and the tawny owl looked out upon the universe from his perch in the larch. Gemini and Orion added their soft fire to the glow of the western sky. Wulfgar gave a bark of joy. Set in the rural hinterlands of an England still recovering from the devastation of the Second World War, A Black Fox Running follows a year in the life of the titular fox, Wulfgar, as well as a number of others of his kind living around Dartmoor, dwelling within the domain of a haunted and vengeful human trapper. On its surface, at least initially, Carter's narrative follows the familiar beats of the classic English fox in fox hunting country tale, and yet from the first few pages, readers will be struck by the bold new path the author carves into the uncharted frontier of animal literature. Unlike in the majority of novels, understandable as the anthropocentric literary status quo may be, in A Black Fox Running, humans are not awarded center stage. Nor, as in most animal fiction, are we depicted as alien beings set apart from the rest of the natural world, serving only as mysterious, malevolent antagonists or making brief displays of immense power for good or ill. But neither does Carter reserve a central place for the beasts of his story. Though the primary narrative of A Black Fox Running focuses on the rivalry between Wulfgar and Leonard Scoble, a foul-tempered, war-traumatized, misanthropic trapper, The author takes a transcendental approach to the novel's focalization. A passage featuring a fox loping down to a stream to drink may pause to take in the distorted starscape rippling on the water's surface, sweep away to follow an owl flying overhead as it dives for a vole, linger with a pair of nearby humans who hear the rodent's dying scream while chatting after a hard day's work, and then circle back to the vulpine protagonist without breaking a stride. He tested the breeze with his nose. The night was brilliant under the hunter's moon. A tawny owl hooted and received a sharp reply from his mate. The fox ran with the stream to the Maniton Beckeford Lane and singled out a strong thread of coney scent. He killed the buck swiftly on the lawn of Aish Cottage. There were no lights on in the building, for the American had gone home. While Wolfgar skinned the rabbit, he dozed in the airliner high above the Atlantic. The tawny owl dropped off the crag called Lover's Leap and released a tremulous cry. It sailed over the river and flopped down in the nettles and gripped the vole, pinching the little creature's scream into silence. Then it entered the darkness beneath the oaks and winged off to the Iron Age fort on the hilltop. A star left the Milky Way and slid across the sky. The moon surprised Wolfgar. It was so big between the boughs. In the hands of a less capable author, such an approach could have easily rendered the novel hopelessly confused, if not nigh unreadable. And yet Carter's elegant and dexterous use of this style only serves to elevate both the primary narrative and the themes which suffuse the entirety of the story. In one early example, when Wolfgar fails to bring down a heron, the author briefly shifts to the bird's eyes, giving the fox's would-be prey a name and a sentence or two describing the circumstances that brought it so close to death. From time to time, even a feature of the landscape may have its history unearthed for readers to ponder, as towering oaks, ancient hill forts, or murky ponds find themselves the focus, however passingly, of Carter's fluid, graceful prose, divulging a secret or two before readers are shepherded on their way. In the stealth of a frosty night, the barn owl's quartered vole runs close to Jay's grave, white of moonlight on white wings, the glaring moors racing to the sky. Kitty Jay had hanged herself in some forgotten winter of man's history. Her grave was a simple mound of grass and stones with a jam jar of flowers at the head. It lay at the crossroads and was visited by tourists. The owls knew nothing of suicide or wrong of any sort, for their purity was of the moonlight through which they sailed. Every so often they screeched at each other as though the silence were too much to endure, but the voles died noiselessly in the grip of talons that squeezed the breath out of them. Remarkably, no matter how varied the tones or circumstances he presents, from blue-collar workers telling ribald jokes in a pub, to the vulpine seer Stargrief meditating on the mysteries of creation beneath a sea of endless stars, and from a young boy exploring the wilds of Dartmoor to starving foxes tearing their prey limb from limb in the night, the author never fails to impress upon the reader the interconnectedness of these happenings, balancing an intimate closeness to his characters with a detached, Zen universality in immersing readers within the world these characters inhabit. In her wonderfully insightful foreword, which serves as both an excellent primer for an initial read and a means of deepening one's appreciation for the novel's uniqueness after completion, author Melissa Harrison describes Carter's style as employing a shamanistic ease in inhabiting the bodies of all the creatures that make up the world of the novel, a phrase whose succinctness I cannot bring myself to surpass. To paraphrase her foreword once more, every individual, be they man, beast, insect, or even tree, is the center of its own universe. As readers, we see as much of the author's constructed vulpine culture as we do of the local humans, with his foxes maintaining customs and remembering histories, revering the great Todd, an older term for a male fox, homonymous with the German word for death, as their deity, observing omens in the natural world, and retaining hope in an afterlife among the bountiful, temperate fields of the Star Place. The Dartmoor foxes have even incorporated the local hunt into their own culture, revering death at its hands as the noblest manner in which their lives can end, an authorial decision that may at first glance offend modern sensibilities, but melds seamlessly with the existentialist qualities that permeate the entire story. After all, our own human religious practices frequently map themselves onto the traits of the environments in which they originate, and, to a wild beast, the alternatives to being run down while heroically testing their mettle against the speed and cunning of the hounds remain the slow, wasting creep of age and disease, the sudden violence of the poacher's gun, and the drawn-out anguish of Scoble's poisoned baits and steel traps. "The hunting wasn't so good," said Ashmere. "In fact, it was terrible. This morning the hounds came to the great down and ran me half to death. They killed a vixen." What was her name? Asked Stargrief. Fernsmoke. I knew her, said Stargrief. She was very young. Nothing lives long, he thought, only the valleys and tors. This morning she saw the sunrise and was part of it. Brambles were gnawing his guts, but his eyes remained blank. They broke her up under the beeches, said Ashmere. It was a clean death, said Wulfgar. His companions nodded. The good death, said Stargrief. But for all their myths and beliefs, their names and histories, these animal characters never feel like humans merely wearing the skins of beasts. Carter's foxes hunt and fight, mate and groom, mark territory and lay scats like wild animals otherwise plucked straight from a Mannix novel. Their lives so authentic in this manner that at times I could almost imagine the author himself possessed some mystical insight into the inhabitants of the wild. They were here last night, said Stargrief. 2 inches of tongue moistened his nose, and he read the air long and carefully. His head moved a little from side to side, and he seemed to lean on the wind, each quiver of his nostrils bringing him a detailed account of what lay in the field and far beyond. Presiding over everything was the smell of gin metal spiced with the scent of passing birds. The earth smelt of ice and moss and nibbled grass. Cattle, men, and dogs. Then the rank odor of the trapper alerted all his senses. Fortunately, Carter's talent for characterization does not falter at the borderline between man and beast, with the human members of his cast fulfilling his efforts to truly show every angle of creation, including our own species at its best, worst, and most mundane. A traumatized, nihilistic veteran of the First World War desperately and violently asserts his authority over the natural world, as a former bombardier from the Second seeks to protect and preserve it. Ordinary farmhands and laborers toil or hunt by day and gather in pubs come dusk, while children, including the author, who cameos as his younger self, roam the wilds of Dartmoor seeking innocent adventure. Even the primary antagonist of the Foxes, the ruthless, temperamental, bitterly misanthropic trapper Scoble, is never reduced to caricature. His hatred of foxes comes from his own terrible wartime experience, stranded in the hellish charnel pit of no man's land for days on end, maimed, abandoned, and forced to watch as scavengers scoured the night for any available flesh, certain that they would inevitably come for his own. He would drink 9 or 10 pints before crawling off to bed, but often he drank more. It had been so since 1918. Cider and whiskey, occasionally at the pub, but usually alone. During the First World War, Scoble had fought on the Somme, where he had been wounded in the legs. The memory of lying in long, wet grass beside a dead mule for a day and a night would return on a wave of nausea. Poor old Charlie the mule. It wasn't his war. The shell seemed to explode under the animal and spill out its tripes. Scoble emptied his tankard and fetched a refill, and the apple log spat and flared white, like a very light. That was when the foxes came, in the darkness, under the arcing flares, 3 of them, snapping and growling and worrying the mule's carcass, there in that ditch in France. For the rest of the war, he dreaded the lonely death and the foxes who always seemed to be lurking on the edge of darkness. Throughout it all, Carter's prose remains among the most beautiful I have ever read, gracefully evocative while never stumbling into ostentatiousness. Flowing from word to word with an almost musical quality, his writing is able to make even the most minor or ordinary event seem like the center of creation, if only for a moment. A perfect marriage of style to the transcendental substance of the story. Sometimes she spoke, but they were words that soon faded from knowing. The joy of living within the moment took them beyond themselves, for there is a state of grace that all wild creatures discover, where the spirit makes its secret assignation with the seasons. None of this belongs to us, Wulfgar thought. We belong to it. We live with it, and in the end it claims us. And while in some sense, the novel's mortality-focused philosophy does echo the themes of Watership Down, A Black Fox Running builds boldly upon this common ground, culminating in a climactic scene that could never be properly transposed to the works of any of the author's literary predecessors. But before discussing this in depth, I believe it is proper to explore Carter's other novels first. Carter's next novel, The Moon in the Weir, was published in 1984, and is the only entry in his Xenofiction catalog to belong firmly to the realist rather than the mythic tradition. While the novel's narrative, like that of A Black Fox Running, is split between human and animal perspectives, the otters of the Moon and the Weir are never portrayed as anything more than simple wild beasts, and serve more to support the main human-centric plotline. This story concerns the final years of the life of Paul Revilius, a childless, middle-aged bachelor and recently retired schoolteacher, who inherits a sizable rural estate from a deceased aunt, while also receiving a dire prognosis for a previously undetected heart condition, with his doctor estimating that he has only a few years left to live at most. With death approaching much more rapidly than expected, Revilius begins to venture further into existentialism, and ponder more deeply what legacy he will leave behind. Taking comfort in the pristine natural beauty of the estate, and the generations of innocent wildlife who have relied upon the property as a refuge amidst a sea of sterilized farmland and countryside eyed by eager developers, Revilius comes into conflict with a local brutish farming baron who hopes to flip the property, and is willing to resort to unscrupulous methods to pressure the newcomer to sell off his inheritance. While I must admit my disappointment at the novel's lacking the mythic cultural world-building of its predecessor, and the relatively secondary role the otters play in the narrative, The Moon and the Weir is still quite a strong story in its own right, full of Carter's trademark philosophical musings on mortality, thorough characterization, intimate knowledge of rural working-class English communities, and lush, nature-celebrating, Wordsworthian prose. The night smelled of something fresh and enigmatic, the kind of nameless scent of the outdoors a cat carries in its fur when it comes in from the garden. The otter gave another of his flat, grunting cries and flew weightlessly on through the stars and the moonlight, which were illusions. He was a shadow like all the creatures before him that had swum the dart since the first dawn. But the river was deathless. It wore the seasons as it wore the moonlight. Revilius's death anxiety is realized in ambiguous visions of Celtic pagan figures half-glimpsed from his bedroom window, performing rituals in the darkness, and the otters whose cherished home unwittingly relies upon his benevolence serve almost as surrogate offspring to a man staring down eternity after a lifetime of relative solitude. The stars provided the palest of light when the clouds scattered. Then the language of the great English poets took on a curious relevance that couldn't be divorced from the beauty of the sky. The deathless beauty. Lord, yes. They knew. They knew. He wiped away the tears and buttoned his Solway. "Dear God," Revilius whispered, "let them mate and make Foxcroft their home. Give all the clean Devon rivers back to the otters again, and let me live long enough to see the cubs." Later he dreamed of otters. The universe was a vast pond, and the constellations were clusters and streamers of their wet moss and water crow's foot. Scary melted into the Milky Way, wearing his coat of many bubbles, undulating through those raging fathoms of light like the biggest and longest nebulae in the cosmos. Scary and Cariad swirling and twisting down the deeps of creation. My largest criticism of the novel, aside from personal gripes about the author's decision to primarily focus on humans, and to dispense with the mythic elements of Xenofiction that so elevated his debut, would be that the climax comes off as fairly rushed. While the rather abrupt conclusion arguably does fit with the themes of a life cut short by disease, the main antagonist's story, in particular, is resolved in a rather contrivedly clean manner. That being said, The Moon and the Weir is still well worth a read to anyone fond of nature writing, especially given the strength of Carter's beautiful prose. The warmer weather flushed more crayfish out of the silt in pursuit of dragonfly larvae, and Scary often visited Lord's pool to catch his delicacy. When color sank in the sky, he would patrol the trout lines for whatever the river had to offer. Resting his elbows on the garden wall, Revilius trained his field glasses on the otter and watched him go about his business. Scary loved the white water of home Weir. He wriggled through it and gave himself to the current and let it play with him. But at night, his whistling across the pond through the rain made Revilius's heart ache. Then everything whispered of the transient, and the void after the creature had fallen silent seemed the fate of all happiness. Three years later, Brian Carter would follow up The Moon and the Weir with Nightworld, centering around a group of badgers living on the southeastern English coastline shortly after the Second World War. And thankfully, his third Xenofiction novel marks a return to the mythic tradition. The badgers of Nightworld live in fear of a group of local humans who engage in the ancient sport of badger baiting, by which the animals are dragged from their dens, saddled with chains or leg-hold traps, and then pitted against dogs in fights to the death, a rural custom that Carter himself viciously condemns in the introduction. Like a black fox running, focalization is divided between the perspectives of the badgers themselves and a number of local humans, among them Frank Rapson, a prominent townsman and avid badger baiter, nicknamed Strawberry for a distinctive pink birthmark on his face, David Garrison, a wildlife painter whose only son Neil was killed in the final months of the war, and whose wife is currently battling tuberculosis in a Swiss sanitarium, and Billy and Sheena, a pair of semi-romantically involved preteens who spend much of their time roaming the rugged coastline and getting into typical adolescent trouble. When the local badger baiting club begins encroaching on Garrison's land, which contains a number of sets, the painter and the two children form a tenuous alliance to protect the creatures from Rapson's persecution, and end up developing an understanding and companionship that crosses the chasm of their age and class differences. The day had a supernatural calm. In the distance was the mica glitter of Froward Point. His eyes strayed back to the promontory, with its strange little humps and wind-angled elderberry. The sketch was part of his effort to make a visual catalog of the entire coast, from St. Mary's Head to the Marl Estuary. A Spitfire droned low across the sea, skimming Dragon Rock and looping up to Buzz Inland. Hitler's war had been over for 3 years, but Garrison kept seeing Neil walking up the road away from the house in Exeter at the end of his last leave. All that cheerfulness and optimism snuffed out. "Oh, Christ," he murmured. "Christ." Along the top of the steeps, the starling flocks were falling, rising, and falling again, only to rise, dilate, and depart. "The purpose of life is to create more life," Garrison laughed wryly. He had been one of the best war artists, quarrying something beautiful and dramatic out of bleak moments of violence like the Normandy landing. From barbarism and heroism to wildlife art seemed a logical step. From a requiem for the human race to a celebration of the natural world. Nightworld features all the hallmarks readers will have come to expect from a Brian Carter novel. Rich, immersive prose, concerns with mortality and the fragility of life, de-emphasis of man's central place within the world, conciliatory exploration of English class divides, and interrogation of rural working-class attitudes towards nature. And while it doesn't manage to reach the heights of a Black Fox Running, the author's decision to return to the mythic character of his debut strengthens not only his condemnation of the cruelty of badger baiting, but his transcendental approach to portraying existence from myriad angles without giving undue precedence to any one of them. Rain beat down and became hail. Blue sky was at either hand and before him, but the shower was slow in passing. Shaking the drops from her feathers, the raven rolled sideways and took the sun on her breast in her dive towards the point. Then out of sheer joy she tumbled and croaked, and at that moment Strawberry shot her. The shift from vivid light into utter darkness was instant. Lifeless she fell to the steeps and was lost among the bracken. Published in 1989, In the Long Dark was the last of Carter's Xenofiction novels, and his final entry centers around feral cats whose loose community is threatened by the arrival of a powerful gang led by the vicious and deranged Tom Skeets. Unfortunately, the author's fourth novel is also his weakest. Rather than employing the split animal-human perspectives of its predecessors, In the Long Dark is told exclusively from the perspective of cats. And though it contains elements of mythic xenofiction, it never truly capitalizes upon these to the extent that a Black Fox Running or Nightworld did, leaving the book's feline culture largely unexplored and undeveloped. Additionally, while the novel still contains above-average prose throughout, true gems are only encountered sporadically, perhaps once every page or two, rather than nearly every sentence, as in his earlier works. And while Carter's fatalistic philosophical musings are present, the title itself being a reference both to the threat posed by Skeet's gang and the looming shadow of broader mortality, here, this subject matter lacks the narrative centrality or emotional weight of the prior three novels. The story itself remains rather unfocused, but unlike in A Black Fox Running, where the meandering nature not only makes sense in following the life of a wild fox, but meshes seamlessly with the transcendental themes, helping the reader to experience the connectedness of all things, In the Long Dark's firm focalization from the cat's perspectives, and heavy focus on the tensions between the two feline groups leads to the novel lacking much else in the way of holding the reader's attention. and this central conflict is resolved quite suddenly and unexpectedly, in a manner likely to leave audiences disappointed. It should be noted that I do not consider this a bad novel by any stretch, only mediocre by the standards I had come to expect from the author, given his track record. Whether this was a result of his feeling compelled to write more at the urging of his publisher, or possibly an attempt to create something more suitable for younger readers, I didn't personally find much worth saying about In the Long Dark, and can only give the novel a tepid recommendation at most, and even then only to those interested in stories about cats. Easily the most common recurring motif throughout Carter's bibliography involves the confrontation with mortality, the fact that all living creatures must inevitably die. In A Black Fox Running, the existentialist mysticism of Stargrief and the harrowing heartache of Wulfgar after the loss of his mate and offspring mirror the lingering war trauma of both Leonard Scoble, their human rival, as well as the nature-championing American veteran Richard Williams. The Moon and the Weir takes a more detached approach, with the philosophical musings of Paul Revilius, who spends his final years attempting to find peace in the natural world his species has been irreversibly detached from by higher consciousness, contrasted against the effortless manner in which the wild animals he protects belong to that very world. Nightworld finds artist David Garrison, already grieving the loss of his son, worried now that his ailing wife will likely soon follow, and turns to capturing, and later actively preserving, the beauty of the natural world, as the badgers of the story come up against a foe who threatens the wholesale destruction of their community, against which they have almost no recourse. And even In the Long Dark features glimpses of this theme in the tomcat Ben's premonitions from which the title is derived, and the aging feline elder Jessie's gradual slipping away into the dreams from which, one day soon, she will never reawaken. While this morbid subject matter is far from unexplored within the realm of mythic xenofiction, as any reader familiar with the subgenre's progenitor, Watership Down, can attest to, Carter manages to venture beyond the narrative and thematic territory of Adams and his successors through his extremely unique and creative approach. The vast majority of stories, naturally, remain centered on human beings, while most xenofiction, especially of the mythic variety, tends to portray our species as alien and godlike, occasionally benevolent and yet always unknowable, existing on an entirely separate plane of reality from that of the animal characters. But by gracefully shifting between human and animal perspectives, Brian Carter gives precedence to neither, instead emphasizing their, and therefore our, shared experience as living beings, placing all creatures on a cosmological par, even as the characters themselves often live in ignorance of this truth. Cattle slithered and stumbled down the lane, harried by a laborer with a stick and a couple of dogs. Fear brimmed the animals' eyes, for they were treated as things, not creatures. From birth to death they bowed to man's tyranny, and were used carelessly, as if such mute calmness could not house a soul. In doing so, Carter also brilliantly elaborates on a pair of derivatives of this point: the impermanence of human accomplishment, and the great blessing and curse of our consciousness that leaves us ever mindful of the past and future, even as the little time we are given steadily dwindles with every passing day. A calm evening brought Richard to the table in the window. Birds dashed across the sky. He opened his notebook, and the pen nib scratched the silence. The cottage was like a clock that had stopped ticking. "The war was the height of human frailty and viciousness," he wrote, "yet I have seen the immortal psychopath in the shaving mirror. There is some awful, inherent, self-destructive, race-destructive flaw in man. We pretend we live in a state of history, but we don't. We don't even live in a state of nature like the animals. We are outsiders, the prowling aliens against whom all the wolf fires have been lit." With his fluid, transcendental approach to observing the events playing out, drifting through the narrative like a leaf on the wind of his own words, Carter provides us glimpses of the history of tangentially important characters and even locations that serve to remind readers of the broader world that always lies beyond our immediate awareness. When Todd trotted into the first dusk of creation, the Dartmoor wilderness was as it is today. Wulfgar and Teg could cross vast tracts without glimpsing a human being. The moors were not old with man's history. Civilizations had come and gone, but little of their glory remained. A few hut circles, some megaliths, pounds, lynchets, terraces, and the odd clapper bridge did not add up to much, all were weathered down to anonymity. Stargrief understood such things. In this, I am reminded of Percy Shelley's Ozymandias, quite possibly the most celebrated poem ever written in the English language, in which the unnamed narrator describes the discovery of the foundations of an ancient monument, all that remains of a once mighty empire. And on the pedestal these words appear: "My name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair. Nothing beside remains. Round the decay of that colossal wreck, boundless and bare, the lone and level sands stretch far away." And this brings us to another of Brian Carter's writings, published a year after his Xenofiction debut, Yesterday's Harvest, a memoir recounting a brief stretch of his childhood lived among the wilds of Dartmoor in the late 1940s, and easily the most engaging autobiographical work I have ever come across. Carter's writing, as in the best of his Xenofiction novels, manages to vary between breathtaking beauty and comical levity, aching sadness and unbridled joy that, while always retaining a degree of childlike innocence and wonder, is now tempered with somber maturity by the process of adult reflection across the gulf of half a lifetime. To stand under the drooping boughs of the cider apple trees hooded with the scent of ripe fruit was heaven, and to walk through a green and silver sea of grass at dawn was to shed my human shape and become a fox. Carter borrowed liberally from his own youthful experiences while writing, which makes Yesterday's Harvest an excellent companion piece to A Black Fox Running, a novel the younger version of himself even cameos in. Describing his experiences in the aftermath of the Second World War, in which so many of his neighbors were lost or scarred, and from which he would bear the marks of trauma after enduring German bombing raids as a helpless child, Carter's memoir manages that most elusive and magical of qualities, to be both heavily grounded in terms of time, location, and culture, and yet possessed of a strange universality that reaches effortlessly across the ages. When a tree is cut down, it leaves a gap in the sky. When a neighbor dies, he leaves an emptiness in the community, and I always felt that autumn was a kind of adagio for lost things and lost people. It was the season of hiraeth, as the Welsh say, using the dusk word that is layered with many delicate flavors of sadness. To fall through hiraeth was to drift down fathoms of grief until a face rose to meet you, or a landscape reassembled and the ache subsided. It was these experiences that would play a large part in shaping the man he became, the man who later went on to write with such longing for the land in which he was free to experience the joys of the natural world through the guileless innocence of youth, something he reflects on directly in A Black Fox Running, through the interactions between his own younger self and adults of various stations. The boy and the American parted company on the Bovey-Tracy Road. Stray ran off to catch the bus to Newton Abbot, and Richard marched cheerfully back towards Manitou. The kid was the closest thing he'd seen to a reservation Indian this side of Montana. What would the world do to him? But he couldn't be gloomy. The otter had escaped, and he'd seen old Blackie again. Sure, the kid would change, but childhood was a separate lifetime anyway. It wasn't just the stifling of the pastoral instinct that dulled the vision. You couldn't endure that intensity day after day. You'd see everything too clearly, and all the mediocrity and stupidity would drive you nuts. Another element that frequently resurfaces throughout Carter's bibliography involves tensions between different social classes, something that the author himself possessed rather unique insight into. Born into a working-class family in the aftermath of the Second World War, in a Britain facing widespread shortages of food, coal, and other essentials, Brian Carter lived near the edge of poverty for much of his youth, though he recalls a stability and strength found through small-town community solidarity and relative self-sufficiency from the wider world in the era before the changes and disruptions imposed by a globalized market. The ubiquity of chain stores and uniform housing developments would forever alter rural life. However, displaying an aptitude for the literary arts from a young age, and encouraged by his parents to excel in his studies, he would place into a fairly prestigious secondary school through his exam performances, at which point he was subjected to both derision from many of his former friends for supposedly betraying his working-class roots, as well as mockery from students of so-called better birth, who saw him as rising above his lowly station. All of this provided Carter with a nuanced perspective on class differences, a topic which rears its head frequently across the breadth of his novels. My sympathies, like those of the other children I knew, were with the fox, and I was deeply suspicious of those well-breeched men and women braying over my head in light saloon bar accents, Wherever they gathered, I smelt violence of a dark, pagan kind. Up Stuggy Lane, I encountered bloodlust like the raw ache of winter. I could not understand why posh grown-ups were allowed to hunt an animal to death. My peasant breeding did not help. It was difficult to look up at a man on a horse without the desire to drag him off. Later I found a different atmosphere at the Great Dartmoor Meets, where the killing of a fox was not perverted to a gory, society caper. And I also learned that the hounds dealt death swiftly, not like the snare, the gin, or the badly aimed buckshot. But at the age of 9, everything registered in black and white. The sleek, red fox was born to freedom, and I loved him, and my heart leapt whenever I saw him flattening over field walls or running through the bracken into Clennon Woods. His enemies were my enemies, and because they came from another class, they were easy to misunderstand and dislike. His Xenofiction novels might easily have left out the perspectives of the rural working-class men who terrorize his animal characters, reducing them to mere background antagonists, viewed only through the eyes of persecuted foxes or his nobler human champions of wildlife. Carter could even have foregone writing from human perspectives entirely, or left them peripheral, in the manner of so many other mythic Xenofiction writers. But much like how his transcendentalist writing never restricts itself on the basis of species, neither does he do so on the basis of social background. From wealthy, well-educated landscape painters to rugged rural gentry, from local town laborers to middle-class teachers, from rebellious teens skirting the edge of poverty as they approach the dawn of adult life, to retirees staring down the looming threat of mortality, and from innocent, starry-eyed children to traumatized veterans still grappling with the horrors of war. Carter draws on his extensive real-world experiences, bolstered by his vivid imagination and deep reservoir of empathy, to portray life in its fullest and broadest. In doing so, his works manage to brilliantly convey the central theme that is woven so deftly throughout his entire bibliography, of the interconnectedness of all things. Rather than simply condemn the destructive tendencies of humanity, he attempts to understand the circumstances, the fears and passions and desires that fuel and drive them. Where Watership Down, Hunter's Moon, and the Stonor Eagles offer rebuke, A Black Fox Running, The Moon in the Weir, and Nightworld offer reconciliation. And not only that, but a path forward, a manner in which we might come to understand the essential qualities we share in common with the inhabitants of the natural world, and thereby step back from the precipice of unbridled anthropocentric domination and destruction. But how often the absence of humans lent eloquence to a landscape? It was difficult to think of an all-loving, all-merciful God after Belsen, and Anne's illness had left what remained of his belief in tatters. God moving in mysterious ways was the threadbare excuse for the inexcusable. How hard it was to bear the suffering of someone you loved. The stink of seaweed was stronger than the smell of wood smoke. It was the iodine smell of casualty wards. Maybe we shouldn't harbor such enormous self-esteem, Anne had said on his last visit when Garrison had voiced his doubts. Maybe God cares equally for everything. Dung beetles, dandelions, saints. A wildflower must be very attractive. After all, it never sins. Somehow it was a sanatorium conversation edged with unreality and desperation. Anyway, he reflected, as the kettle began to purr on the Ega, gratitude for life should make saints of us all. And this brings us, finally, to the climactic scene of his debut, A Black Fox Running. Throughout the novel, Wulfgar is troubled by a string of recurring questions spawned from his rivalry with Scoble. Where does mankind stand in relation to the rest of creation? Is he a creature like the foxes, or merely a force beyond their comprehension? And can he feel joy and love, suffer pain and sorrow, and even die, like they do? Wulfgar felt reality slipping away again. There was a sense of unbelonging, as if he had never been a part of what was going on around him. He snapped at a fly before it could land on his nose. Many flies covered the mummified body of a crow where it rested, among the nearby ling. Sheep, ponies, cattle, crows, foxes, everything came to final rest under the sky. But he had never found the carcass of a man. Having obtained partial revenge for the murder of his mate and pups through luring the trapper's deranged lurker Jacko to the dog's death, Wulfgar then sets his sights on the man himself. With the pitiable Scoble sinking deeper into alcoholism as the land of Dartmoor is subjected to one of the most brutal winter storms in England's recorded history, the Black Fox, his new mate, and their sagely companion lure their mortal foe into an ill-advised pursuit through the wintry countryside. Ailing and intoxicated, Scoble stumbles after the foxes through the ice and snow, a rifle clutched in his numbed hands, and, already delirious from his illness, suffers through a harrowing series of flashbacks as the past returns in a chaotic, disorienting flood before he finally collapses to the ground to let the cold claim him. All night and for most of the next day, the moors were glazed with frost, which the Devonians called the Amil. Scoble's body lying in Hator Quarry was part of the savage beauty. From his mask of ice, the trapper stared blindly across the pond to the beam where the 3 foxes had sat watching him die. "It's done," said Stargrief. "They do die, then," said Rowan Fleet. "Like sheep," Wulfgar said contemptuously. Despite the antagonistic role he has played throughout the novel, despite the cruelty of his actions and his vicious, unrelenting pursuit of the heroes, and despite the reader's sympathies naturally being inclined to the side of the foxes, Scoble's death is presented as genuinely tragic and moving, even as Wulfgar himself comments on the anticlimax of learning that his mortal enemy, the force that defined so much of his life, that took so much from him, is capable of dying just like any ordinary beast. Even in this, are we ultimately alike? It could be easy to assume that, given the fatalistic nature of these stories, Carter's works are unduly dour or morose, but, while certainly being steeped in nihilistic and even pessimistic philosophy, his novels remain suffused with a spirit of joyous revelry in the beauty of the natural world and the gifts of life. Mankind's alienation from nature is presented as tragic, but both Carter's human and animal characters are able to find peace and tranquility from time to time, even if it comes far more easily to the latter than the former. Hill foxes have a wide range, but Wulfgar was to wander farther than any of his kind had dreamed possible. The good life was found in the pursuit of prey, in the running between sunrise and sunset. Living in the sacred manner, Stargrief called it, and he simply meant letting the mind lope ahead of the body. This theme is most strongly encapsulated in the character of Stargrief, the Vulpine seer and mentor to Wulfgar, who has managed to endure for 9 years in Dartmoor, a feat nearly unheard of among his kind. Stargrief remains thoroughly aware of the suffering inherent in life, and occasionally even slips into bitterness himself, but never for more than a fleeting moment, for the aged seer finds too much joy and beauty in life to bring himself to curse it, even amidst the pain and hunger and despair. "You look very pleased with yourself," said Redbriar. "Do I? Well, we've beaten the trapper, and that doesn't happen every day." Redbriar grinned and licked his muzzle. Stargrief suddenly felt an intense sorrow, as though an old wound had opened inside him. For a while the sensation puzzled him. Then he realized what it was. He was in love with life, of which he had so little left. One of my favorite moments from Carter's entire bibliography comes in the form of the chapter On Hay Tor, in which Stargrief climbs to the summit of the titular peak, receiving a vision as he gazes out into the innumerable stars. Age no longer seemed a penance, and Stargrief trotted joyfully to the foot of Hay Tor and scampered up the rock face from south to east, where the scrambling was easy. On the bald summit he lay among the autumn stars. The Milky Way dusted his fur with soft light. Buried in the brilliance of the star stream were the constellations. The beauty of the night made him cry. The stars twisted, swelled, blurred and burst from his tears. He looked down at his paws until the bittersweet feeling had passed. Life droned gently through his body, and all around him the night gave up its scents and smells. Bracken crushed by hooves, sodden grass, furs, sheep, ponies, dying leaves. The silence was ancient and inviolable, and it helped the spirit rise to Todd. Life itself is worship, Stargrief thought. By living I am praying, I am a prayer. A great bird larger than a buzzard cruised down the valley. Now Stargrief was a spirit like the wind, gliding over the familiar moorland. Everything had changed. The towns were many, the houses were tall, and roads ran wide and long where the fields had been. Only there weren't any people or cars. Under the great tor huddled the cattle, sheep, and ponies. No foxes, he thought idly. Then a vast, blinding light filled the sky, and all the towns were burning, and the mushroom cloud was billowing up. And the darkness swept in on a mighty wind, heavy with the reek of death. He moaned and drifted back to Wulfgar's vision. Several seasons had passed. the foxes were coming out to tread the silent, beautiful land. Great flocks of wildfowl shadowed the sky. Larks sang, the vixens screamed, the curlew called. Here and there, a skeleton was slumped over the wheel of a rusting car or tractor. In the garden of the hillside farm, the remains of a man, a woman, and a child lay face down, reduced to bones, elemental like the flints. Even in the face of the threat of nuclear holocaust, Stargreave's vision retains a faith that the natural world will endure, as it always has, not necessarily in the same way, but that it will endure nonetheless, adding an optimistic gleam to Carter's musings about the impermanence of mankind's mark on creation. It would be a mistake to assume that the author laments the fleeting nature of our accomplishments and attempts at dominance over the world. Rather, he mourns the fact that so few of us recognize the truth of this in what little time we have. There is a persistent motif of both the human and animal characters suspecting this element of mankind's existence throughout Carter's bibliography. As Wulfgar himself muses after narrowly escaping death at the hands of the hunt, "O foxes, O my blood brothers and sisters, under the tree the shade was cold, the crisp tinge of autumn was on his nose. To live is to run, always running, away from death, into death. Perhaps man kills us to kill a memory. We are ghosts of man the animal, and he can't live with the knowledge." On some deeper level, Carter suggests that we understand the way in which we stand apart from the rest of the world, or at the very least perceive glimmers of this truth, and that this frightens us because it shows our dominance and mastery for the passing illusion that it truly is. Higher consciousness is not merely a mighty gift, but at the same time a terrible burden. Throughout Carter's writings, parallels are repeatedly drawn between the loss of childhood innocence due to aging, and the loss of natural innocence due to the development of this higher sapience that has enabled all of our species' achievements. As Richard Williams, the world-weary bombardier attempting to find peace in nature, reflects upon meeting the 9-year-old Brian, who is so easily able to immerse himself in nature, what would the world do to him? But he couldn't be gloomy. Sure, the kid would change, but childhood was a separate lifetime anyway. It wasn't just the stifling of the pastoral instinct that dulled the vision. You couldn't endure that intensity day after day. And this thinking is reflected in Carter's closing lines of his own memoir, reminiscing on the vanished landscape of his halcyon youth, and the people who inhabited it, now gone forever beyond the confines of his own memory. Unknowingly, I had found Avalon. It was yesterday, and I went there as a boy and drifted through the dreaming orchards and sailed across the water meadows where the fox danced and the barn owls called at Dempsey. When the snow has melted, Mom said, all the fields will be green again. And they were, for a little while. Now they have vanished, and I see the funeral of my childhood among the housing estates and holiday camps where those long summers quivered like hallucinations. Oh, Jenny in your faded dress and sandals, the sun sparkling on your hair and blue summer mornings in your eyes. The larks go on singing and singing over Cider Mill Hill. Time stops flowing, and I move on, although the voices call me back. I have run through the dew, but my footprints no longer smudge the grass. In crafting such radically creative and yet undeniably authentic portrayals of the world he so loved as a child, Carter serves to immortalize that vanished past in a way which echoes far beyond it, and by placing non-human characters on the same level of cosmological importance as our own species, speaks to far more than a simple memoir could ever hope to. In a strange way, it almost seems poetic that Wulfgar's story itself was very nearly lost to time. Capturing the magic of Xenofiction at the peak of its power, alternatively adventurous and vulnerable, intimate and heart-wrenching, and imbued with a profound understanding of both humanity and nature at their most beautiful, terrible, and mundane, the works of Brian Carter deserve a place on the shelf of any lover of animal literature.